Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma, and I've got Chris with me today. And we're going to be talking about maybe some unexpected or under discussed shifts that we've seen in the employment landscape post COVID. But before I get to all the questions that I've got for you, Chris, can you give everybody an introduction?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Emma. I really appreciate it. It's been great to get to know you here recently as we've crossed paths so many times on social media. So social media is not a bad thing when you make great friends and find great alignment to discuss. But so my name is Chris Cline. I'm currently the executive director at ACT, which is the Agents Council for Technology with the National Big I. But prior to that, I spent nearly 30 years on the carrier side and had done quite a few different things there, had a ton of opportunity and made great contacts and really fell deeply in love with this industry. But in super compressed period of time, I started off as a graphic designer. So I was fine art major, found my way into the insurance industry. And really from there, just had the opportunity to do so many different things from sales and underwriting, compliance, employee training, underwriting and sales leadership. But I spent a big chunk of my time as part of a senior team that led distribution for a regional carrier, and just have a great passion for the industry, but had really grown through out of necessity, I think, for my own career and even my own personal benefit. Became a real champion and student of emotional intelligence and how that ultimately bleeds over into culture, and now even my later career desires to be a meaningful part to helping drive DE&I initiatives to the organization. So all of these things that come together with somewhat esoteric and maybe intangible components and conversations about what does it mean to be a part of an organization and to feel like a valuable contributor beyond the tactical things that we're all very comfortable talking about.
Well, I'm excited for this discussion, and you also get bonus points for sneaking the word esoteric into your introduction. I really appreciate that. So I teased here at the introduction that we were going to be talking maybe about this shift that isn't the first thing that comes to mind for people. We talk about the Great Resignation, we talk about remote and hybrid work, but there's this other little idea that's connected to those that we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail. Can you kind of break that idea down for everyone?
Yeah, and gosh, here we are launching into 2024, and it feels maybe a little bit cliche and stale to talk about the pandemic and how that impacted many of us at, the organizations we lead and us as individual employees of our organizations. But one of the things I've noted, because I am an example of exactly what we're going to talk about. I was someplace for 28 years, actually longer. I interned there. So like a lifer, if you will, and had an opportunity that presented itself that took a very long time to manifest. You could ask Ron Berg, who retired before me. I think it was 5 or 6 months of courtship to get me to consider it. And I just started to have this epiphany that you only live once, and why not give it a shot? It was aligned with some passions I had around wanting to help the industry in different ways and to be a part of some different conversations. And this was an opportunity, at least I thought at the time, to make that come to fruition. And as I've been in this role, I thought I have had a wonderful network, but I was really involved in the industry on the carrier side. But this opportunity has doubled, if not more than doubled that. And Emma, what's happened is I've met a lot of people who used, or whether they were intentional about it or it was something that was happening inside them and they couldn't wrap their head around it, a lot of later career, a lot of high tenure of employees made career changes coming out of COVID. And they all have slightly different stories. Everybody uses a slightly different language to describe what they were feeling, but we've all likely read something or been through it ourselves where we thought, as we were going through that period of time, as a society, about getting right with what we cared about, what our passions were, what our values were, and how we wanted to spend the rest of our lives. And I've just seen a lot of folks in a lot of different ways and industries inside of and out of insurance but even a lot of the different verticals inside our industry, there's examples and people that I've become friends with and had this conversation that, 10, 15, 20-year careers, that they decided to go try something different. And what's happened is that a year or two into this transition, they've had some epiphanies that they hadn't really expected to have. And again, different words, different experiences, because they had been someplace for so long. And I think took a different stock or didn't have a complete stock of what it meant to be someplace for so long. So I'll kind of stop there and see if that generates any follow-up.
Well, and so what I want to dive into is maybe some of those anecdotal discussions that you've had about like, what are the pieces that people maybe like didn't give full stock to or didn't anticipate moving when they made their way to a new organization?
Yeah, and this is esoteric twice, right? No, but these are somewhat philosophical and they're deep and they're a little bit emotional, and they're hard to describe. So I kind of use the cheesy analogy. It's kind of like the wind. Really hard to describe, but when it's windy, it's windy, and everybody knows what that's like. And so the best way I can describe it is when you've been someplace for a while, whether you love it or whether you are growing to have displeasure there, or, even worse, you are, whether you appreciate it or not, a part of the fabric of that organization. And I think when you translate this to, or consider this through this lens of changing careers, most everybody is conditioned to think about what's the job description, what's the salary, where am I going to have to go, who's the boss, what's the financial stability of the company, what am I going to do? Am I going to have to move? What are the tools I'm going to get? And you should. And as an employee or as a hiring organization, you need to have those things laid out pretty well and be able to tell that story. But when I've talked to some of these folks, and again, I mean, I really enjoy where I'm at, but these are some experiences I had. When you leave an organization, what it's really hard to recognize is how much of just the nuances of day-to-day life that come naturally, the informal processes, the hallway conversations, the friends, the deep networks, the somebody to bounce something off of, did you hear that the way I did? Somebody coming to you for that, the mentorship, those kind of things sound squishy, especially if you haven't lived in a world where they're no longer there. But everybody, I say everybody, a lot of the people I've talked to, and I'm run out of hands and fingers to count the folks that have all articulated something similar, is that they don't feel at home or as much like at home at their new place, even though all of the things that we've traditionally been encouraged to look at check all the boxes. And when you start to dig deep on that, a lot of that has to come down to, it's just that being a part of the infrastructure. And again, to overuse the word fabric, you're no longer that. You're like this swath of cloth that was ripped out and now placed somewhere else. And how do you start to think about the value of that and how to put personal and maybe even an artificial financial value on that when you consider making a move? And that can look differently for everybody based on the role they had, the size of the team they were on, maybe the level of authority and accountability. Are you a leader or are you an individual contributor? But I would bet if anybody who's been in an organization for a number of years, particularly when you get into the double digits, you are a part of the fabric of that company, regardless of how important you think your role is or isn't in that organization.
I think that the visual that you just like mentioned of like being a piece of fabric that's like ripped off and then put onto a different blanket. It's like you're like that like new piece of the quilt that's like stitched on with a couple of stitches, but not all the way completed yet. And it takes time. And I think that that's a really important thing to recognize, especially for people that are going through this shift. If you've been at a company for 2 years, you might not feel that longing and like, again, that deep connection to the fabric of the organization that you do if you've been there for a very long time. And you and I talked about this with like a move in my career. I went from a company where, and I was aware that I was giving this up, but at the same time, and it was the hardest part of moving on from that job. And it was still the right decision. I'm still happy with like where my career has gone. But it was the first place that I learned how to sell. It was where I discovered my passion for technology. It was where I became a mom, and every single person in that company knew me and my family and my children, and they threw me baby showers. And not that the new coworkers that I had weren't wonderful or whatever else, but it's like, it's almost like parting ways with your friends from high school and moving on to college. You know that you're going to go find new friends, but that doesn't stop the longing that was like present and the things that you're missing from maybe those relationships that you had when you were in high school. And so this was something when we started talking about it that I was like, yeah. And it was a struggle for me. And I didn't know if that was like a normal thing, or if it meant that I made the wrong choice, or all of those different things that come into play with this. But especially with what you were talking about in that first response, and kind of the shift that happened with a lot of people maybe aligning their life with a hybrid or a work environment, or remote work environment, all of these types of things that people were searching, but maybe not looking at like the whole equation and what that means and what they need when they go to that next chapter. So where I want to take the conversation now before we part ways is like, what ideas do you have then that we can do on the employer side when we've got people like inexperienced or experienced resources coming onto our team, but specifically maybe people that we know have gone through this or are coming into leadership positions?
Yeah.
How do we change or shift our onboarding to really make it more of like an integration process?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I guess one of the things to think about too is that, when you rip yourself out as a swath of cloth from a large piece of fabric, the company you left likely can just sort of assimilate that, right? And even if there's a shock to you leaving in your production and those kind of things, it's a blip. But now you're this standalone piece of cloth that's very uniquely shaped, might have your own rough edges and all these things that you bring as tangible assets to your new organization, or you wouldn't have been brought in the first place. And so acknowledging that you're coming in with a unique set of skills, but I also really challenge the hiring organization, especially when you're hiring an employee of tenure or somebody who's been someplace for a while, to think about what somebody is giving up in this less tangible kind of way. Again, the things that we talked about that are check boxes that everybody goes through, and most companies have a pretty robust training and onboarding. And I think those are two very different things in my mind. How do you use the tools, and how do you feel an expense, and how do you use the processing equipment? And the onboarding is a little bit of a cultural thing, but it tends to stop. And what I have seen, and this is, I think, a dark part of the conversation, is that in these scenarios, there's an element missing, because these folks had something that they're now starting to grapple with losing, that they had to struggle to put words and something like tangible around. But then you start to have these emotional epiphanies that they're not there. And so I think about, as an organization that really wants to dive into this and capitalize on what you just were able to procure and the talent you're able to add to your organization, how do you think about training and onboarding with a more longer tail, and through this lens of how do we create a belonging experience, or a fully integrated experience? Integrated seems a little bit impersonal, but that concept of how do you start to replicate what it's like for somebody to have a mentor and to know just sort of the informal ways things get done in an organization, and the shortcuts through the building, if you will. That will look different in every scenario, but I think there's real value in thinking about beyond the videos and the employee forms that we all fill out, and the here's how do you use the systems, and here's your new boss, and then go shadow somebody for a while. How do we create a longer tail on that? And if you haven't experienced that a lot, I think what's happening, and I've read some studies, Emma, and I'll say these things and we'll kind of stop here for a second. I've started to think about this through this. I couldn't find a word for it, but I'm calling it like the double bounce. And so we're now at this point now where we're on 1, 2, 3 year window where people who made this move, maybe coming out of the pandemic, are now really starting to have these epiphanies and wrap their head around it and feel like maybe I don't fit here. And it's a real tight spot to be. And so what happened when they were at the old company, when they were there and they were part of the fabric, that also implies that there was this built-in loyalty and allegiance that substantiated them through rough times and good times. When they get to the new place, if they don't feel aligned or they don't feel like a part of it, they haven't built the loyalty because there hasn't been any work on either side really to build that sense of belonging. So what we're starting to see is people who left someplace after a number of years go someplace 12, 18, 24 months, and now they're looking to go somewhere else. We could get really into the deepness of regret for leaving, but this is more about like, I'm still looking for that I was searching for. And I saw a statistic, and they're all over the board. It was supposedly a LinkedIn study that said in 2024, nearly 80% of respondents said they're looking for a job in 2024. And that's up from around 30% in 2023. And I can't correlate all of that to this concept, but it does seem to coincide with this. People made some moves and they're figuring it out. And now maybe there's this recognition that I haven't really fulfilled what I'm looking for yet. And so there's an opportunity for employees to think more deeply beyond those things that we talked about. Like, what does it mean to be part of an organization? And then for the hiring organization to think about how do we create a real opportunity to truly integrate and create a sense of belonging for your staff, because you don't want to invest in the recruiting and all the other things just to have a really highly talented and coveted high tenure experienced employee join your firm for them to bounce.
And I'm on my second bounce. So I would say, for me, that was the discovery of like, I am actually seeking to change the approach that I take and look at like, starting the business with my husband and that kind of thing. And it took some time for me to recognize that like some of the angst that I was feeling probably wasn't because of the position or the company that I was in, but more about like needing a wider change and more of a drastic approach to kind of like finding out exactly what that career looks like. So the second bounce sometimes can be where it fits, and maybe you need one more bounce in between.
Right.
But I would thank you so much, Chris, for joining me for the conversation and talking through this concept, because again, when we started talking about it, I was like, you know what, this was something that I experienced, but I haven't really like discussed it with anybody. So it's very interesting to recognize that this is something that is not unique to me and that there's a lot of people going through this. But I would encourage anybody that's not to follow Chris on LinkedIn. And you see that little book there in the corner. Make sure you check that out as well, and reach out to Chris or I if you've got any questions about the conversation that we had, or maybe need some advice on how to figure out your double bounce. But thank you so much for joining me, Chris.
It means a great deal that you invited me on your show, and I appreciate the chance to talk about this. Hopefully my passion for the topic came across, and if collectively as an industry we can help one person just have a little greater clarity into the choices they're making, it's a win to me. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you everybody for watching, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Leading Change. If you liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe and come back weekly for more expert interviews on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.